Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for this situational briefing featuring our honored guest today, Ambassador Michael Oren, who served as Israel's ambassador to the United States of America from 2009 to 2013. We have a limited amount of time with the ambassador. I just want to begin by thanking my team at the Miriam Institute, Rosita Panini and Alan Langer, for helping to bring this about. And thank you, Ambassador, and to you and to your team for giving of your time and of your attention, your wisdom. I look forward to being educated by you during our conversation. And I want to encourage our listeners that if they do have any questions, they can put those questions in the chat box, or they can email those to us directly, a number of which we already have. And I'm going to dive straight into it, Ambassador, if I may. Thank you again for being with us. It's always an honor to have you. And I would like to touch upon the subjects that I mentioned as we invited the folks who are here, which are the attempt at judicial reform and its fallout, the recent discord between Israel and the United States, security threats, challenges, and opportunities. So let's begin with judicial reform. Dr. Oren, prior to the Prime Minister halting the attempt at that reform, I wrote a piece publicly calling upon him to do just that. Not for a moment do I assign his decision to that piece, but I'm someone on the right of Israel's political spectrum. But from the right in the United States of America, I drew considerable fire from people who made all sorts of accusations about me siding with anarchists and anti-Zionists and appeasing the BDS movement and a host of other things. And as I said in a previous webinar, I'm not really moved by that at all. But what is clear to me is that whichever side of the debate one takes, people who have not lived in Israel, have not served in Israel, have not fought in Israel, who will not send their children to defend Israel as you have done, they seem to struggle to understand the rend, the tear that this overhaul was causing within Israeli society. I'd like to begin by asking you, if you agree with that premise, feel free to tell me if you disagree. I'd like to begin by asking you to try and talk to us about just how strained Israeli society was becoming, and to some extent still is, as a consequence of this attempt at judicial reform.
Great, Benjamin. First of all, it's always great to be with you. Thank you, to the Miriam Institute, to all of your listeners. Shalom from Jaffa. Very cold and windy Jaffa. Tonight, believe it or not, was it the 2nd of April, the coldest day of the year here. This is what we call global weirding, not warming. It's freezing outside. Let's take 10 steps back, shall we? Let's look at the background to this crisis, the antecedents. 5-6 years ago, I was in the Knesset. And I was working on an issue known as judicial reform, reform of the Supreme Court, because it was clear to me that the situation was not sustainable. And what was not sustainable about it? You, who are Americans listening to this program, have not one but two opportunities to influence the composition of your Supreme Court. You vote for the President of the United States, who nominates the judicial candidates, and you vote for the Senate, which confirms them. Mm-hmm. We in Israel have almost zero input. If in the United States, the composition of the Supreme Court is a major electoral issue, I know in my own family in the United States, people vote for the president on the basis of the type of judges he or she would nominate. That is not the case in Israel. It's never an issue in our elections. It's never come up once. And that for the simple reason is that the people have almost no input. The judges on the Supreme Court are chosen by a panel of 9, which does contain some ministers from both the government and the opposition, but the deciding vote lies with jurists, and the deciding vote of the jurists lies with sitting judges on the Supreme Court. Now think, if you're a judge on the Supreme Court and you've got to find a replacement for yourself, you're not going to find somebody who disagrees with you. You're going to find someone who's going to continue your worldview, your legacy. And so the Supreme Court is basically, in terms of its worldview, was treading in place circa 1992, 1994. The Knesset, meanwhile, had moved precipitously rightward, because the Knesset reflects public opinion in the way that the Supreme Court does not. So the gap between the Supreme Court and the Knesset widened until the link between them was fraying and threatened to snap. And we saw it happening. We saw it happening, not quite slow motion, as the Supreme Court overturned again and again pieces of legislation passed by the Knesset, all told about 30 pieces of legislation. Now, that's just the beginning of the problem. Then it gets deeper. The basis for overturning these pieces of legislation, these laws, was a concept known as reasonableness. Now, Israel does not have a constitution, so the Supreme Court can't rule laws unconstitutional. It has to vitiate them on the basis of unreasonableness. Now, unreasonableness is highly, highly subjective. The Supreme Court determined by a majority of 10 out of 11 judges that the appointment of Aryeh Deri, a twice convicted criminal, to a ministerial post in this Israeli government was unreasonable in the extreme. But the 400,000 people who voted for Aryeh Deri did not find it unreasonable in the extreme. So who's right? Unreasonableness is a highly subjective, very abstract basis for overturning a law. Next problem was the notion of activism. The president of the Supreme Court back in the 90s was a very intelligent man named Aaron Barak, and he came up with this notion in Hebrew, akol shafit. Everything is adjudicable. The position of this computer on my desk could be determined by the Supreme Court. The lighting above me could be determined by the Supreme Court. It's funny, but the Supreme Court determined, for example, repeatedly determined the placement of the separation barrier, the security barrier between us and Judea and Samaria. In one particularly controversial ruling, the government of Israel decided not to return the bodies of Hamas terrorists who had been killed by the IDF until Hamas returned the bodies of our soldiers, which had been in Hamas custody since 2014. I think that 98% of Israelis agreed with that decision, but the Supreme Court overruled it, and Israel was forced to give those bodies back to Hamas. Give you an idea, whatever basis they did for doing that, it was highly, highly controversial. To make matters even worse still, in contrast to the United States, where you have three co-equal branches of government, you have the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. We only have the judiciary and the legislature/executive, which are basically the same. The government is drawn from the Knesset. The prime minister, when he comes into the Knesset, is not referred to as Prime Minister Netanyahu, but Knesset member Netanyahu. We're all members of Knesset. And therefore, we only have one check, not two checks, on every branch of government. So if you weaken the Supreme Court, you basically open the road to a possible treading on minority rights, and that's what the Supreme Court does. It just defends minority rights, whereas the legislator represents majority decisions. And you could have a situation, theoretically, where an extreme government could outlaw LGBT people. It could annex parts of Judea and Samaria without submitting it to any type of serious domestic plebiscite. It could take any number of measures, and we're going to see how that plays out actually in this current government, and why so many hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the street, precisely because of this, the fear that there would no longer be any check on that government. Now, my approach to Supreme Court reform was very, very different than the current government's. I came a position of the importance, and indeed the supreme importance, of maintaining judicial review. That is the pillar of just about any democratic system in the United States, including the American system in the United States, whereas the Supreme Court has the final word. So that's judicial review. The government's reform platform, by marked contrast, sought to basically gut the Supreme Court of judicial review. And it did it in several ways. In one way, it sought to appoint judges by the government. The government would appoint the judges and not by committee. In fact, that's quite the way most Supreme Court benches are chosen around the world, again, including the United States. But that was only the beginning of the problem. The other problem was that in order to overturn a law in the Knesset, the reform of the government wanted 14 out of 15 judges to vote in favor of overturning. Now, you know that almost never happens. Look at what happened at the Supreme Court. You're always going to have dissenting votes, and this allowed for only one dissenting vote. And then finally, and I think most egregiously, the government's platform called for an overriding law. And that law, if the Supreme Court turned down a piece of legislation, the Knesset could overturn the Supreme Court by a majority of 61 votes, which is the smallest majority you can have in the Knesset of 120, and every government has to have at least 61 members of Knesset. So it's automatic. In essence, there would be no more judicial review. And apart from hearing, various appellate cases, the Supreme Court would actually have no ability to serve as a check on government. No ability to government. Now, that was the background. And it was exacerbated manifoldly by the nature of the government itself. Here was a government that included two ministers in particular who were unabashed racists, who were advocates, or let's say they were devotees of the former racist Rabbi Meir Kahane, of the mass murderer Baruch Goldstein. They had gotten record of saying numerous racist things before against Arabs, but not only against Arabs, also against homosexuals, against Reform Jews, conservative Jews. And they were in this government. They had very powerful positions. Bezalel Smotrich, a gentleman who I know well from Knesset, very smart, very capable, very racist, got the position of the Ministry of the Treasury, the Finance Ministry, but also he got a special ministry within the Defense Ministry in charge of West Bank settlement. The other, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was denied service in the IDF because he was too racist and had a long criminal record for incitement and violence, got the position of Minister of Internal Security, which includes responsibility for the police and our internal security service, the Shabak. Those of you who are fans of Fauda, that man is now in charge of that. That's talk about putting the hens in charge of the hen house. Okay, that was one highly inflammatory move by the government. The next was the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox presence of the government, which is very, very significant. And the ultra-Orthodox were given an immense amount of money to support their independent educational system. That's an educational system that provides less than a second-grade education to ultra-Orthodox children, keeps them dependent on their rabbis. And that system, if perpetuated, will prove existential to the state of Israel for the very simple reason. In the next 20, 25 years, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the elementary school children in the state of Israel will be ultra-Orthodox because that population grows so fast. And if that population graduates and then is unable to join in the economy of Israel, contribute in any way, nevertheless, much less the defense of Israel, but the economy of Israel, the country will no longer be sustainable, and those people will refuse to pay for it. Those who can pay for it will leave, and our tax base shrinks every year. So Israelis were incensed by this, and then finally there was the Prime Minister himself, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been a source and focus of ever deepening dissension with the Israeli public. There have been many demonstrations against him for years now, facing 3 counts of corruption and bribery in the courts, and wanted to pass legislation that would gut the courts and basically render him immune from prosecution. And also other very bizarre pieces of legislation, such as a law that would pay for Netanyahu's private residence in Caesarea, another piece of legislation that would enable him to receive gifts to the amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars from foreign donors that would pay for his defense in the trials. So all this combined with these reforms to incense Israelis to a degree which, frankly, I've never seen. And I've seen an awful lot, Benjamin. I was here certainly during the early 80s, and the 500,000 Israelis who came out in the streets to protest Arik Sharon after the Sabra and Shatila massacre, forced Sharon's resignation, and 500,000 people in a population 1/3 of the size today was very, very massive. I've seen it all. I've never seen anything remotely like this. The estimates reached as many of 600 to 700,000 Israelis took to the streets across the country. That would be the equivalent of about 10 million Americans coming out for a demonstration. And what can I say? Nara'iti gam zikanti. I'm getting on in years. I remember the anti-war protests of the 60s and the 70s, where American youth went out and burned the American flag and called America with a K and spit at soldiers and policemen and called them pigs. These were outpouring of love on the part of Israel's citizens. They carried the Israeli flags. They stood and sang Hatikva. They kissed the soldiers, blessed the army, blessed the police. Very, very different. very different. Although I'll go into greater detail, even 700,000 people is not the majority by any stretch of the population of Israel. Vast majority of Israelis stay at home. I'd like to spend some time talking about that as well. But that is basically the battle lines here. And the great fear of Israelis that should these reforms pass, then pieces of legislation such as those that were being advanced by the ultra-Orthodox parties, no electricity on Shabbat. You go to the Western Wall, the Kotel, with a tank top shirt, you can spend a half a year in prison. Military service to put on the same footing as studying in the yeshiva. And that would be the tip of an iceberg that would basically eliminate liberal Israel and replace it with something else, and provide the prime minister, particularly this prime minister, with near dictatorial powers.
So you've said so much there that's so important to have been said. I'd like to ask you a question that I wasn't intending to ask you. You have just very, very succinctly and clearly elucidated the problems with the judiciary as it currently stands. What accounts for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is oftentimes thought of as being the master of narrative, master of the media, resolutely failing to communicate why he felt, put aside the cloud of the indictments for a moment, why did his side of this argument fail so resolutely to present it and to market it in a manner as clearly as you've just done?
Because it got obfuscated by so many other issues, the ultra-Orthodox issue, the racist ministers, the fact that Netanyahu himself is facing these corruption charges and has a credibility problem. Successive governments have fallen because Netanyahu purportedly has failed to live up to the promises, particularly his last rotation government with Benny Gantz, the head of the Blue and White Party. A credibility problem. He has a credibility problem now, even though Netanyahu, even though the Likud is now negotiating, the coalition is now negotiating with the opposition under the auspices of President Isaac Herzog. The vast majority of Israelis, so those who are out in the street, do not believe for a second that he is negotiating in earnest.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you now, let's go back to the question about this rend in Israeli society. You've said something that's so important. Your memory in Israel goes back further than my own, of course. And I have just brought, together with the Miriam Institute, about 30 active officers of the US Army for a strategy and policy tour of the country. And they were on the ground 2 weeks ago, and they heard from generals, and they heard from ambassadors, and they heard from whomever one would like for them to hear from. And time again, those speakers would say, with the exception of Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, those speakers would say, listen, this is just another crisis in a long list of crises. This is no different to anything else that we face. And I disagree with that. And you seem to disagree with that as well.
I disagree with that too. Yeah.
Tell us why it's different. And tell us, by the way, what supporters of the reform are missing when they say this is bending the knee to anarchists, this is bending the knee to anti-Zionists. What is it that they're missing there? I know what I think, but what do you think?
Let me tell you about the other part of Israel. They have to understand that there are two parts of Israel here, and then you'll understand the nature of this very deep schism and why it's so serious. So say 700,000 people went out to protest, but there are close to 10 million Israelis. And among those 10 million Israelis, there are a great many people, particularly people in my neighborhood. I'm in South Tel Aviv. It's a working class neighborhood, who view this entire crisis not as one about reform and democracy and liberalism and rights, but a matter of ethnicity, race, and class. They see an elite, very educated, Ashkenazi, Western Jewish population, which has never reconciled itself to its loss at the polls, its loss to the working class, the people from Eastern backgrounds, the Mizrahi, and has now rallied around the last bastion of Ashkenazi elite upper class power, and that is the Supreme Court. There's only one Mizrahi judge on that Supreme Court, even though the Mizrahim outnumbered the Ashkenazi. And they view the charges against Netanyahu as, forgive the expression, trumped up. They're trumped up. And I will tell you honestly, as someone who's followed these cases since day one, I know they probably would never even make an American court. Never even make an American court. And I find them to be unserious charges. Yet the state, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the deep state has spent tens, maybe hundreds of millions of shekels to advance these cases. The police have ruined the lives of state witnesses, treated them brutally in order to bring down a democratically elected prime minister. And that's the way people in my neighborhood see it. Whereas the people protesting want Israel to be sort of a normal state. They want it to be a state of the arts, of culture, of great food, of great beaches, of equality for all, for sexual equality, gay rights, women's rights, Arab rights. They believe that the conflict with the Arab world is coming to an end. In contrast to all that, the people around here don't want to be a normal state. They want to be a Jewish state. They'll say that the Jews were always abnormal. We were created as an abnormal people. That's God. The other state. Why would we want to be Sweden here? Why would we want to be France? We only got one Jewish state. Got a bunch of Europeans. They like the good food too, but they give greater precedence to tradition and faith. They do not believe that the conflict is over. I want to say this rather crassly. They believe that Arabs, even those who are rather friendly, secretly want to do us in, and that we have to be constantly on guard. And even in matters of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, they'll say, yeah, they're racist, but they're sort of like our racists, whereas the previous government included an Islamicist Arab party, which, given the chance, would have eliminated the state of Israel entirely. So who's the racist here? They'll say, not me, they'll say. And so what you have in this crisis, what appears to be a crisis over laws, judicial reform, checks and balances, minority and majority rights, is actually something far, far deeper and profound. It's a clash between Israel and the Jewish Israel. Israel is the democratic Jewish state. And the big question is whether these two Israels are reconcilable, whether we can bridge the two. And we've bridged the two successfully for 75 years, more or less. The question is, can we continue to bridge now that these bridges have been so dangerously cracked? And they're definitely cracked. And as far as the people around me are concerned in this neighborhood, that the government, in agreeing to suspend the legislative process, capitulated to the mob. The labor union, the Histadrut, which went on strike for the first time for political ends, not for financial gain, right? After financial rights, first time it was a political strike. Simply became an element of extension of the corrupt government, the corrupt deep state, if you will. The closing of Ben Gurion Airport has never happened for political reasons. Right. Only one other reason the Ben Gurion Airport closed, that was because of Hamas rocket fire. And
2014, right? Protective edge.
Yeah, 2014. Now the Jews closed Ben Gurion Airport, but for what purpose? And so a very different perception of what's going on here. And bridging that gap, that schism, will be very difficult, Benjamin.
Do you think the other Israel, as you referred to them for the purpose of the thesis you just presented, did they do themselves a disservice, therefore, for staying at home? Now, they will say that they didn't stay at home. They went to the voting booth during the elections, and they voted in favor of a government that they knew was going to push judicial reform. But the left, or the opponents, I want to correct that phrase, the opponents of this
reform, not just leftists.
They're not just leftists. I want to make that very clear, and thank you for underlining that they're absolutely not just leftists. But the opponents of this reform, they also, of course, went to the polls, and they didn't meet with victory, but they didn't let that dissuade them from taking to the streets and standing up for that which they believed in. Why did the other Israel that you've just defined in that term, why did they stay home, Dr. Oren? What prevented them?
Until the last night. Until the last night they stayed home.
Yeah.
Because they were incensed. Now they are incensed because they just lost the battle. They didn't lose the war, but they lost the battle. And they were quick to point out, and I think interestingly, that while thousands of reservists, many of them from elite units, pilots, said that they wouldn't report to reserve duty. Many startup entrepreneurs said they were going to move their money out of Israel, and then they were going to move their staffs out of Israel, their business out of Israel. These other Israels said that when the state of Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, in a merciless fashion, we moved 9,000 Jews out of their homes in Gaza and destroyed 21 settlements. Nobody on the right said they weren't going to report for reserve duty, and no right-wing entrepreneur said he or she were going to leave the country and move their money out of the country. Yes, and that other Israel will say, listen, we're the real Zionists. These other guys are conditional Zionists, and That's a very powerful thing to say. Very powerful.
So you've spoken a bit about the domestic rent, and I think that what you've said is so important. I hope that people will take into account what you've described, because I think that even in Israel, the folks that I heard during the course of that tour that I mentioned, I think they're underestimating this. I think they're understating it. I think there's a fundamental failure to understand what's going on. My greatest crisis that I saw was prior to the disengagement. Okay. That was nothing like what we've seen this time, in my opinion, back in 2005, the disengagement.
But I guarantee you, the next time there's a disengagement like type decision, the response of the opponents will be very different. This has been what we've done is we've tinkered with the DNA of the state. This is the first time when state institutions like the army, like the airport, like the Histadrut, have been used in opposition to a policy. I have never seen it. And I've been here a long time, and before the time I have an historic memory as an historian. And I never seen anything like it. Not during the vicious debate over German reparations in 1952. Not during even during the mass protests against the Oslo Accords, which also it came very close to sowing dissent and even violence, and ultimately did culminate in the violence, the assassination of my boss, Yitzhak Rabin. Have I seen anything like this? However, and there's a big however, I'm going to take a deep breath and take a step back and say, I don't know anything or any country that can equal that which we have witnessed in Israel over the last month. I mentioned just briefly that the equivalent of in America per capita would be maybe 10, 12 million Americans coming out to the street and marching peacefully. Israel is one of the 5 or 6 countries in the world, along with the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that has never known a second of non-democratic governance. Not a second. Think about it. None of the Europeans, none of the Africans, none of the Asians, really. And we're the only country in that list that's never known a second of peace. Which has to be has to rank in one of our towering accomplishments as a society, given the fact that where I'm sitting is about a 7-hour drive from Beirut, a 6-hour drive from Damascus and Baghdad, and we've seen now people coming out and demonstrating for democracy out of love for their country with great respect. And I don't know a country like that. Look what's happening in France right now, Benjamin.
Yes,
France is on fire.
Yes. Over a far more,
excuse me, I don't want to say trivial, but
I'll say it.
Over adding 2 years to the retirement age. I mean, really, think about this, and that in itself is quite extraordinary.
So it bears mentioning, incidentally, that to your point about those who did not support the disengagement from Gaza, not only did they not threaten to not serve, but they actually doubled down. You saw a higher representation in the officer corps come about within the Israel Defense Forces. They proactively engaged. But let's talk a little bit about defense and the fallout of the judicial reform debacle in the dimension of Israel's security. How
very severe.
Okay, so you rank it as very severe. So you believe that there is a nexus between what's going on domestically and our external threats, and I'd like you to establish that. And then after that, I want to go to the other aspect of this, which is the Israel-US fallout somewhat. I know I've looked on at your statements lately, and I agree with them. I want to get you to talk about that more. But for now, talk about the defense threats that emanate from the judicial unrest, or the unrest surrounding.
It's Israel's fiddling while our region is burning. Burning very close to us, literally under our heels in Judea and Samaria during the month of Ramadan, as the Palestinian Authority continues to disintegrate, and Islamic Jihad and other terrorist groups fill that vacuum in places like Jenin and Nablus. That's why we've had so much fighting there. And should large-scale violence break out there, Israel will be hard-pressed to respond to it. I question whether this government has the legitimacy now to order an operation like Defensive Shield 2002, when the IDF reoccupied the Palestinian cities in response to the Second Intifada. But far more hazardously is what's happening with Iran. We've had, in the midst of all the demonstrations, we had a Hezbollah bombing incident that seriously wounded a man in the north. The Hezbollah terrorist was apprehended, was killed, was shot, but it was clearly a probe by Hezbollah to see if we're able to function at all. Meanwhile, Iran is not walking but racing toward military nuclear threshold. One aspect, the United States are about 2 weeks away from a bomb. And here is Benjamin Netanyahu, the man who has made stopping Iran from getting that bomb a paramount issue for now close to 30 years, is busy with reforms. And I think you've seen another indication of that was the signing of the reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, mediated by the Chinese, and there's a lot more to be said about that. And while many have attributed that inflection point to the withdrawal of the United States from the Middle East and the increasing presence of China in the Middle East, we can't rule out the possibility that it also reflects the fact that Israel is a no-show. And the Saudis and other Gulf Arab countries have looked to Israel to be a great defender against Iran. And now Israel is not in a position to order a defense against Iran. You know, many people don't know, Benjamin, I often ask as a trivial question, who is the commander-in-chief of the IDF? I'm not going to put you on the spot, but it's not the prime minister and it's not the president. The commander-in-chief of the IDF is the Israeli government. And Israeli government
I wouldn't actually have answered that. I wouldn't actually have answered that correctly. Thank you. So
many people know that.
No, I didn't know that at all.
Not send the army to war.
The chief of staff. So the commander-in-chief, sorry, the prime minister is the security cabinet, and then via the chief of staff. So yes. Okay, thank you. So
it's a process. It's not like, you know, the president of the United States in many circumstances, you know, there's the War Powers Act, could order, you know, the country to war, but the prime minister maybe can order an operation, but a large-scale war, you know,
needs to go through cabinet.
Off to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, fighting off Hezbollah, fighting off Hamas, fighting off Shiite militias in Western Iraq, fighting off the Houthi rebels in Yemen. That's a regional conflict. The prime minister does not have that authority, and I would argue that the present government doesn't have that authority, because many Israelis, including many Israelis who serve in these units, in the combat units, will say, "Oh, well, Bibi's just trying to distract attention from his internal problems." I don't know. There was an old saying in the 60s, what if someone threw a war and nobody came? I question whether Israel had to act against Iran and nobody came. People didn't show up. And I think the Saudis at some level internalized that. Very severe. And then I know you want to ask about the United States. It has had a rippling impact on our relationship with this administration.
Tell us about that, please, because we heard contradictory viewpoints. Just to set the stage a little bit, Ambassador Nides, once Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that he was going to step back or pause judicial reform, Ambassador Nides expressed that in the near term or soon enough, there will be an invitation to bring Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House for that coveted meeting. And then obviously President Biden gave an emphatic no to that idea, not pouring cold water, pouring scorn all over the idea. Has since been walked back a little bit, but I'd like to know how you judge that.
Well, yeah, Tom Nides is a cherished friend of mine and great ambassador, but he is an ambassador, and I am no longer ambassador, so I'm not under similar restraints. But it's like this. Joe Biden, I know very, very well. I know his senior staff, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan. I work with them very closely, and they are pro-Israel. They deeply care about the bilateral relationship. They care about Israeli security, and yet they are Democrats, and you know, they have a very significant wing of their party, the Progressives, they're angry. They're angry at the White House. The White House has not made good on its promise to reopen the American consulate in East Jerusalem. Hasn't really clamped down on Israeli settlement building in Judea and Samaria. Has not condemned openly demolition of illegal Palestinian buildings, etc. That wing of the Progressive Party 10 years ago when I was in Washington was small and afraid of Barack Obama. Today, that wing is no longer small and is afraid of nobody, least of all President Biden. And they make their pressures known. And did
you predict that, by the way, just to interrupt you for a moment? Did you predict that? Because I remember when they first came on the scene, people dismissed them as a minority group on the far fringes, never to permeate the central DNA of the Democratic Party. Were you of that view?
No, I was not. And I made a similar prediction about the Tea Party.
Mhm.
When I mentioned to my staff at the embassy that we have to follow the Tea Party, it's going to be very significant. They all laughed at me. And what I saw was that in American politics, which was becoming increasingly polarized and radicalized.
Mhm.
And it made sense that on one hand, you'd have the Tea Party and its successor, which would be, sort of the Trumpist Republicans, the MAGA people. And the other hand, you'd have the progressives. And getting, the progressive and the woke and et cetera, that be moving all the way to the left, while other people on the other side were moving increasingly to the right. That's the polarization. But these groups have grown increasingly influential. And though I don't think the president or his secretary of state or his national security advisor belong to that wing of the Democratic Party, they do have to respond to it.
Mhm.
And I saw it up close during our last fighting with Gaza in May of 2021, where Biden came out every night and said Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has to defend itself. But I knew behind the scenes that he was under increasing duress and that our clock was winding down. And finally, after 9 days of fighting, the president let it be known unequivocally that he expected the war to end that night. And 80% of Israelis were against declaring a ceasefire. We wanted to keep on sticking it to Hamas. But when the president said, that's it, you want to keep me as a friend, you got to end the war, Israel ended the war. Israel ended the war. Now, what you've had since then is an accumulation of grievances, provocations, with the appointments of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and their remarks, the pogrom against the Palestinian town of Hawara, Smotrich's support for that pogrom, his claims, his denial of the existence of a Palestinian people, his support for settler violence, Ben Gvir, et cetera, et cetera. You have the rescinding of a promise made to the Bush administration back in 2005 by Prime Minister Sharon that Israel would not build Ford contested settlements in the northern Samaria, Hermesh being one of them, and rescinding that promise, going back on that promise over and over again. And I think it builds up in the gut of the president. Now, I know the president very well. As I said earlier, he has a tendency to go off script. He did it when he came here. He got off the plane. The first thing he said was, "I am a Zionist." Mm-hmm. And oh my God, you could almost hear the collective sigh from the progressives on Capitol Hill. That the president just said that. Now, for them, who Zionism is a curse word. The president just uttered it publicly. Talked about his love for Israel, unfettered love for Israel. It was amazing. But he was off script. He also said the United States would use force against Iran if Iran, broke out and created a nuclear weapon, and that was totally off script. I can see all of his advisors, knocking their heads. But here he went off script and lambasted Netanyahu and his judicial process a day after Netanyahu had capitulated and agreed to go to meet to the mediation at the president's house with the opposition. So it's almost as if the president didn't get the memo. Now, having said all that, why is this a strategic threat? I mean, America's not going to cut off its aid to Israel. And the aid is above all a massive subsidy by the federal government of the U.S. arms industry. The money goes to the arms industry and they give us the arms. It's the whole thing is a subsidy. They cut off the aid. They're going to have to explain to tens of thousands of American workers why they lost their jobs. It's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think even politically be very impossible in Congress. Then why is it dangerous? Because of, I would say, 3 measures which the United States could not take. It's not what they can do to us, it's what they could not do for us. So during any war, going back to 2006, the Second Lebanon War, Israel has always had to go to the United States for resupply. We run out of ammo. Our soldiers spend about 1 million bullets a day. In 2014, we ran out of Hellfire helicopter-borne rockets, air-to-ground missiles, and the Obama administration withheld that resupply.
And I want to emphasize, you're referring to in the midst of conflict, there's
in the midst of conflict,
no
yes.
ammunition, not afterwards.
No, right in the midst of that fighting.
Right.
Sure. That was a precedent and also a warning about the future. The Obama administration also abstained on a condemnation of Israel in the Security Council of our settlement building policies, Resolution 2334, enabled that resolution to pass, That resolution can now serve as a basis for an effort to impose international sanctions and boycotts on us. So it has a strategic ramifications. America just stood back and let it happen. Behind the scenes, they also supported it, but that's another story. And then the third thing, is in addition to not casting the veto, not giving us resupply, the United States could step back and let other countries boycott us, sanction us. There are things which the United States could not do, which would have a strategic import for us, a deleterious strategic importance for us, on us. And we have to be mindful of that. We are building up a groundswell of ill will. And that ties into the non-invitation of Netanyahu to the White House. Joe Biden bears a Ramat Shlomo scar. When he was here in 2010, I escorted him as ambassador. While I was here, elements in the Israeli government announced that there was going to be a major building project in an East Jerusalem neighborhood known as Ramat Shlomo. That was perceived as a slap in the face to the vice president, a slap in the face to President Obama, and it created a huge crisis, one of the worst crises we've known in our history. And I think Biden wants to avoid a situation where Netanyahu comes to the White House. He's sitting in the Oval Office, and all of a sudden there's an announcement that there's been another pogrom in the West Bank, and that Israeli ministers are supporting it. And Netanyahu is going to mince words and condemning it. And then you've got yourself another massive crisis on your hands. It won't. I don't think it'll redound to anybody's benefit, neither Israel's or the United States.
On March 27th, so just a couple of days ago, you wrote an opinion piece which likened Israel's security situation to that of a bank account, and a bank account that you judged at this time to be in perilous overdraft. And I'm quoting you there with that phrase, perilous overdraft. Now, you wrote a lot in that article. It's a very interesting article. I'd encourage people to read it and also to disseminate it to their contact list. And I want to zone in on one aspect of that, and feel free to speak beyond this question as well. Therein, you actually say that about the states of Israel, especially under its new government, Israel's been operating in the red, again, carrying forward this metaphor. Support for unrestricted settlement building in Judea and Samaria, ministerial backing for settler violence, and the destruction of a Palestinian village, Hawara, the denial of the existence of a Palestinian people, and even the legitimacy of the state of Jordan, all have drained Israel's bank of its deposits. The threat to Israel's democracy, the foundation of Israel's alliance with the United States, places us in deep overdraft. Now, I've got a specific question that I wanted to ask you, given your former position as Israel's ambassador to the United States, and it's born out of frustration that I ask this question. But Bezalel Smotrich, this is an individual who is astride the world stage in various places, various obscure forums, to be perfectly frank, but it makes headlines nonetheless. When a sitting Israeli minister openly advocates the destruction of a Palestinian village, that village Hawara again, what are and first of all, apart from it sickening me, what are the likely ripples or waves that a statement like that create in the White House of now President Joe Biden? And I'd really like to know, is he watching that? Is that something that he is responsive to? And also, why is this minister running around making these statements? He's the Minister of Finance. He's really not being asked about policy with regards to that, though he does hold this junior position within the defense establishment, within the defense ministry rather now. And why can Netanyahu not bring this man to heel? Is he letting him doing his bidding to the right base within Israel to some degree? What's going on there?
Well, the two different questions. Is Biden following this? Indeed, he is. Yes. I think very closely, emphatically, his staff are following it. And, give a not unrealistic scenario that tomorrow there's settler violence in a certain part of Judea and Samaria. In response, the Palestinians strike back with demonstrations. Demonstrations turn violent. The violence turns into terror. Israel mounts a counterterrorism campaign. And I think that the willingness of the United States to back that campaign, the way George Bush backed Ariel Sharon's defensive shield operation in 2002, because Sharon had put deposits in the bank many times, as had Barack before him. I think that the willingness of the administration to support us will be circumscribed, and that I'm saying that word, in italics mind. Why can Bezalel Smotrich get away with it? Why can Bezalel Smotrich get away with it? Because he can. Because he can. Because this is not the Benjamin Netanyahu we have known in the past, which was a very strong Benjamin Netanyahu. Now we have a weak Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu always likes to be in the middle of his coalition. He likes to have parties to the left of him and the right of him. He now finds himself being the leftmost person in his own coalition. And every faction in that coalition has a gun to his head. And so he cannot come down hard on Bezalel Smotrich or on Ben-Gvir, lest he loses his government. And if he loses his government, he believes he's going to find himself in the docket. Ultimately, he's going to find himself in jail. And the deep state will have won. That's the way he looks at it. And so they can get away with it. And I must say, I mentioned I knew Smotrich from years in Knesset, and 6-7 years ago, Israeli journalists used to ask me who was the most powerful person in Knesset. And I used to respond, immediately, unhesitantly, that it was Bezalel Smotrich. And they would all look at me with their mouths agape. What do you mean? This little guy in the back bench, he's about, 5'5", this guy. And I'd say, yes, he's the most powerful man in Knesset because he defines what is right wing. And the minute Smotrich says this is right wing, the entire right lines up to the right of him. And I watched it happen again and again. Very smart, very powerful man, very dangerous. And he's doing it again within the government. He's acting with impunity. Baby's trying to rein him in and not succeeding. Now, he told Biden that he had his hands squarely on the steering wheel, but it's clearly he does not. Look what happened with my friend Yoav Gallant. I served with Yoav in the Kulanu party. I know him well, very fine man. Here, while the president was just coming home from a trip, the prime minister was just coming from a trip from London, Gallant got up in front of the nation and broke ranks with him. And forced Bibi to fire him. Now Bibi is backtracking and not firing him. He does not look strong. And I don't believe that in this government he is strong.
So I want to talk a little bit more about Gallant in a moment, but before going there, it's perfectly so you would dismiss the idea that Netanyahu is essentially allowing Smotrich to speak as a mouthpiece, as giving, if you like, red meat to the right base. You don't think that that's the case. You think he simply can't be reined in. Is that your view?
I think that Smotrich is appealing to a certain constituency. And I remember I'm talking to people in my neighborhood. Yes, hear what they're saying. And they're not necessarily the people who are interviewing for the New York Times. The New York Times interviews the same leftist analysts every single time. It's amazing. It's amazing. So misleading. Misleading. One almost thinks that there's a class and ethnic camaraderie between the New York Times and that same elitist Ashkenazi group. You think they'd have more sympathy for people from different ethnicities and different class backgrounds, but no. They see Smotrich as representing something pure. They see Smotrich as saying the truth, they hearken back to a time early in the Zionist project, where if there was a terrorist attack against an early Jewish Zionist settlement, the men of the settlement would get on horseback with their guns and ride through that Arab settlement and set houses on fire and shoot people, and then it would stop. And as far as they're concerned, the Middle East hasn't changed that very much.
So let me ask you a question about this coveted trip to the White House that Bezalel Smotrich may well be impeding, as well as Benjamin Netanyahu impeding himself. Why does it matter? I mean, what actually, apart from the obvious optics of a prime minister going over to the White House, what actually takes place in those meetings that cannot take place absent such a meeting? How valuable are those meetings, pragmatically?
No, they're valuable. They have two parts to them. They have the plus one parts, and that could be the prime minister plus 5 members of his staff, up to 8 members of his staff, and that's usually a lunch that goes on for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then there's the one-on-one. which in Hebrew is referred to as the four-eyed conversation, though I'm always careful to tell Israeli leaders that four-eyed is a derogatory term for people who wear glasses, and to call it a one-on-one or face-to-face meeting, they never listen to me. It's always full-eyed. And that is usually supposed to last an hour, but almost invariably goes over that and could be double, triple that even. So it is substantive. It is substantive, and it can be harsh. Netanyahu just wrote in his memoirs that in his first meeting with Obama did something that terrified him, that scared him, right? It shocked him. I don't know if terrified is the right word. It shocked him, but he didn't write what it was. So I'll tell you what it was. And quite shocked. This is what he told me. Netanyahu came out of that meeting and he looked pale. I had never seen him like that. And we went into a secure room. And I said, "What happened? What happened?" And he said to me, the president looked at me and said, "You know what I do with people who disagree with me?" And then went like this.
Really?
That's the president of the United States saying that to the head of a democratic country, an ally. Now, that's quite severe. Now that, I don't know why Netanyahu wouldn't want to say that, but I was there when it happened, and I'll testify to it. And so those discussions can be very hard. The plus one plus is not usually that hard, but it can be substantive.
Did you see the president make that gesture?
No, it was one-on-one. It was one-on-one.
But Prime Minister Netanyahu told you about it thereafter immediately, and you could see that he was physically shaken as a consequence of that.
Yep. Wouldn't you be?
Yeah, I certainly would be. I mean, I'm shocked to learn that it was that, actually, because I also read the memoir and I also wondered what it was. Not for a moment did I think it was a gesture.
I know.
Like that. Yeah.
I know.
So I want to turn now to two other quick points in the remaining time that we have, which is about 20 minutes. I promised I wouldn't go more than 75 minutes, Dr. Oren. I won't do what you just described of going double and triple over the time that's allotted. I'll be faithful to that. But you made a point on, I watched it on Ynet on the Israeli news channel. You made a point about the lecturious nature of the US administration toward Israel with regard to its democratic character. And you expressed that they ought not to be lecturing about that in the way that they were doing, given America's own recent struggles with its democratic character. Can you talk to us about your comments there? I'd like you to speak those in your own words and tell us why you felt it was important to remind people of that.
Yeah, I think that two issues. I mean, keep in mind, Israel, the United States remains our ultimate ally, and the bedrock of that alliance is our common and shared democratic values. And therefore, we have not just a moral, and I would even say Jewish interest in maintaining Israel's democracy, we have a strategic interest in maintaining Israel's democracy. Having said that, the United States, which just over a year experienced a violent attempt at a coup, the takeover of the U.S. Capitol, should not be lecturing anybody about democracy, particularly about a country like Israel, which I said earlier has never had a coup, nor even attempted coup, and just had these massive demonstrations that were done, singing the stinging Hatikva and playing the Israeli flag. It's very different than what happened on January 6th of last year in Washington. And I think a little humility would be called for here. I also am troubled by the singling out of Israel. We mentioned briefly that the French are undergoing are experiencing demonstrations at least as large as ours, violent, and I don't see the president coming out and expressing concern for the future of French democracy. Singling out Israel is a problem. Under the IRA definition, it can lead into anti-Semitism and encourages anti-Semitism. So I would deeply advise the White House to dial that back. Last point: criticism of that nature tends to boomerang. If there's someone who thinks that it's going to somehow buffet support, build up the opposition to Netanyahu, it's just the opposite. There's an Israeli reaction, which I think is a basic human reaction. When you see your leader being beat up by a bigger bully state, you tend to rally around him rather than desert him, even if that bully is the great ally. And I see it happen with Netanyahu during the Obama years, but I'll tell you the same thing happened when Begin went head to head with Reagan, and when Shamir went head to head with Bush the father, and even when Ariel Sharon went head to head with the earlier stages of the second Bush administration, the 43 administration. It tends to boomerang. And again, we have intimate relationships. There's a long-standing friendship between Biden and Netanyahu. It would be much better if these remarks were kept off the record and made person to person.
No, I want to, before I come to that last issue, which is Yoav Gallant, I actually want to read a comment here that's submitted by a very good friend of our organization named Bill. And I know Bill, I've met him. He's very active within the RJC and other organizations, deeply concerned about the future of Israel, deeply supportive towards the state of Israel and supportive of the US-Israel relationship in a way that is frankly beyond reproach. Bill's written here that there are many of us, I'm quoting him, in the USA, who are Republicans and conservatives. We look at what's happening and we say that elections have consequences. And those who are demonstrating in the streets are left-leaning who, having lost in the election, want to oppose the positions and changes of the people and parties that won. Now, I know, Dr. Oren, that you've addressed yourself to this, but I wanted to bring this up because what Bill is expressing is from a place of good, but it is precisely that it reflects precisely the dissonance that I would be very pleased if someone like you could try to bridge. It's just not that simple, is it, in Israel?
Well, obviously, we have talked about the polarization in this country. You know, this Manichaean view of Israel, which is people, you know, on one side in my neighborhood, as opposed to the people a couple hundred yards north of here in North Tel Aviv. And he's entirely right. Elections have consequences. And the democratically elected government is empowered to make changes. But there are two mitigating factors here. One, let's say three mitigating factors. Let's start with the fact the composition of the government and the inherently inflammatory and destabilizing nature of that government, whether it be the radical right-wing racist ministers or the ultra-Orthodox who are being paid not to contribute to the economy and not to serve in the army. That already are factors which don't undermine the argument, but they mitigate against it. Mm-hmm. But the big issue is that this government won a very narrow majority. Yes, it has 64 seats in its majority, but at least two of those seats were given to the government by the breakup of two parties, one an Arab party and another extreme leftist Israeli party, Jewish party. Mm-hmm. Which didn't pass the threshold. So their votes went to other parties, and most of those votes went to the Likud. People who would never in their entire existence, earthly existence, would vote for the Likud or for Benjamin Netanyahu ended up voting for him. And so on a very narrow majority, this government was taking measures that would fundamentally change the nature of the relationship between the judiciary and the legislature and leave, so many Israelis believe, leave the liberal population of Israel exposed and vulnerable to changes that would alter their ways of life in a very fundamental way. And that's it. So yes, on paper, this government had every right to do what it did. But as we know from politics are not just about paper. Politics are about people. And therein lies the rub. And to the degree that I understood that there had to be judicial reform, there had to be, I knew this years ago. But I also knew that there was a way to do it. So I could plug this. So this book just came out yesterday. I have another book coming out here. I always have a book coming out. This is called Israel 2048. Can you see it?
This is your plan for where Israel should be by 2048, right?
It's my vision for Israel on its 100th birthday. And there are 21 chapters here dealing with every aspect of Israeli life, diasporas relations, Palestinians, Arabs, Jews, educational policy, health, labor relations. It's in here. Mm-hmm. But there's a whole chapter on judicial reform. And I wrote this 3 years ago when I was sitting in the Prime Minister's office. Mm-hmm. And I put down my ideas. And my ideas are remarkably similar to what the issue has been going today, how Supreme Court judges are chosen, the scope of the Supreme Court and the need to narrow it. But there was one huge difference. And I think I said this at the outset of my remarks, is the difference between what's in that book and what's happening in the floor of the Knesset today is the great importance which I attach to preserving judicial review as one of the pillars of any democratic system. So you can reform the Supreme Court without gutting it.
So I've got about 12 minutes left on this clock, and I'm really appreciative of all of your time, because I know I've been watching. I know you've been on TV station after TV station, radio after radio.
I'm still made up.
Thank you, thank you so much for the stamina that you're showing here and the candor that you're answering these questions with. I want to ask you a couple of other quick questions, then I'm going to come back to Gallant, and I'll do it all faithfully to the clock. Look, we've talked a lot about judicial reform. It strikes me that actually the Knesset is in urgent need of reform, right?
That's another chapter in the book, Benjamin.
Is that in the book?
Is that?
I mean, what on earth? What are the prospects? That is an unholy, ungodly mess. What goes on with the Knesset, right? I hope you agree. Much more so than anywhere else. Is there any chance? Does any party have sufficient pull and interest to bring about a reconstruction of the way in which the Knesset operates, our parliamentary system? And it also raises a question that's submitted here from Boris, who has asked, does this crisis lead you to believe that Israel will draft a constitution? I have a clear answer on that, in my opinion. But
I have a clear answer too. That's another chapter of the book. You're going to have to get the book.
Okay.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time talking about the need for political reform, and suggest that sort of the way to go, and I think many people would agree with me, would be a bicameral house, where one house is a national house, the other is a regional house. You'd be the distinguished representative from Jaffa. I'm here in Jaffa, and that would be very important. I talk about the need to increase the number of members of Knesset. We are woefully underrepresented in Knesset, proportional to our population. To increase the staffs of Knesset members, a U.S. congressman can have up to 24 members on a staff. We have 3.
Oh.
So, and what they have to act as drivers and legislative assistants and secretaries. It's ridiculous. And there has to be a separation of legislative from the executive. There are many measures that would make Israeli democracy more efficient, more democratic. Now, I don't recommend emulating a lot of the American models at all. America is far from a perfect democracy as well, but we can take what's good in it. And one of the aspects I think that would really improve the relationship between the government and the population would be that type of regional representation, where if you have a sewer line that's breaking down the street here, you know exactly who to go to in the Knesset. Chance of making a constitution. So I come out in this book against the constitution. I've been a long-time opponent of a constitution for Israel for well over 20 years. And the reasons for this are explained in the book, and they are that first of all, I don't think Israel could ever attain a constitution. I don't think the United States could get a constitution today. I think it was a rather unique moment in 1789, and even then that was not without controversy. And that one of the reasons that this country coheres at all is because we don't have a constitution, because we have a lot of flexibility. We have a lot of areas in the gray. If we forced every Israeli school to fly the Israeli flag, we'd have a revolt on our hands with the Haredim and the Arabs. If we tried to collapse this highly fractious, diverse population into an inflexible constitutional framework, the constitutional framework will break. And so I actually support the British policy of accruing basic laws, which will amount to a constitution.
So I want to just finish off with 2 quick questions. The first is about Yoav Gallant. So Yoav Gallant, as you mentioned earlier on in this conversation, is someone with whom you entered politics, right?
Yes.
You both entered under the...
I actually recommended him for the post.
You did?
We were in the party. They said we need a general, and they mentioned several generals, and I said, no, we need Yoav Gallant.
Why did you say Gallant?
Because he was a person of integrity, and he was a real soldier. He wasn't, what can I say? Didn't come from the intelligence corps. As they say in Hebrew, was a guy with a knife between his teeth.
Yeah.
And soldier. And a soldier doesn't take a step such as he took. Doesn't take it sort of blithely. And when he first got appointed in the position of defense ministry, I got on Israeli television. I said, this is a different foreign policy team that we've ever seen. Eli Cohen also joined me with the Kulanu Party as the foreign minister. Tzachi Hanegbi is the national security advisor. Ron Dermer as the regional security advisor. That's a very solid foreign policy team, and nobody was going to stab Bibi in the back. That's what I said. I don't think Yoav stabbed Bibi in the back, but he reached a point where his process. So he also supports reform and would vote for reform, but he called for a halt. And the reason he called for a halt was because of the growing number of reservists who were saying they wouldn't report for duty, and that was having strategic and defense ramifications, he feared. A very hard choice. I don't in any way envy him, but he made it, and I wasn't surprised. That's the Yoav Gallant I know.
But it worries me, because Yoav Gallant, to build upon what you just said, this is the former commander of the Israeli naval commandos. This is a former commander of the Southern Front. He was tapped to be IDF chief of staff, and then ultimately was removed from that possibility by way of something that is nothing more than a snafu by today's standards at best, or at worst. Right. And he comes out and he says that he calls for, after paying his dues politically, right, holding different ministerial positions, none of which were his true dream.
He was housing minister.
A housing minister and so forth. And none of those were his dreams. His dream was to be defense minister. And he comes out and he says that he would like to halt judicial reform. He's then fired for doing it. And then 2 days later, the prime minister says basically exactly the same thing. And he's pilloried from the right, from the person you just mentioned, from Bezalel Smotrich's camp and Itamar Ben-Gvir's camp, and they call him a loser and a coward and a traitor and a leftist. Firstly, what do you make of that somebody such as Gallant can be, who's clearly done this for ulterior motives, for pure motives rather, when he stood up and spoke? What do you make of the fact that someone like that can be so roundly evicted from the rightist camp by people to the far right? And secondly, where does this put you? I mean, you are somebody, anyone who listens to you, who reads you, I still don't believe, I'm sorry I'm going through presumptions, I still don't believe that your time in Knesset is necessarily done. If you see the right opportunity and position to go back there, I think that it will be greatly informed by 2048, your book, which I would like a signed copy of, please, Dr. Oren, if that's okay. Yeah. But let me just ask you a question directly, and I say this with a heavy heart. Aren't you too good for the political scene now in Israel? Anyone who's read you, anyone who's listened to you, knows that you, by going into politics, returning to politics, you're stepping into some of the most toxic waters that there are. I spoke to Dan Meridor, someone who you will know of very, very well, and I asked Dan, a former prince of the Likud, I said to him, would you ever go back into politics? He said, with the way things are now, I don't think I would know what to do or how to do it anymore. Yeah. Are we to have a political system bereft of people like you in the future in Israel? Is this going to be the preserve of people like Bezalel Smotrich and Miki Zohar and that ilk? And what do we do about that?
Well, let me say just a word about Yoav. Again, I reiterate, I respect him very much. I like him. He joined the Likud, Benjamin. And Likud is not a party. Likud is a family. And irrespective of whether the family is right or wrong, you don't break with the family. And in Likud, they know that he was never really a Likudnik. He was in the army. He joined later in Likud, and he started his political career with a breakaway faction from the Likud, and that was our party, Kulanu. We were traitors to the Likud. I was never a Likudnik, but some people, the head of the party, Moshe Kahlon, had been a Likudnik. So he had already joined the party with an asterisk over his head, and was it's kind of on a probation. And so people are saying, hey, we were right all along. He was never really with us, never really part of the family. And similarly, people like Nir Barkat, the former mayor of Jerusalem, my commander in Beirut in 1982, I've known him for 45 years, another very fine individual, did not come out and break from the Likud. And he started his political career as a member of Kadima. And he knows you don't break from the family. And there's a price to be paid for that. There's always a price to be paid for that, unless you were born in the family, unless you come into the family, like the Biton, who was born a Likudnik. But I used to ask people the Likud when they joined the Likud, and they say on the 8th day, I was brought into the Likud. So that's for Yoav. I don't know what his political fortunes are going to be now, because traditionally he may be too right for the left to support, and not sufficiently right for the right to support. As for me, when I sat down to write this book, Israel 2040, I made a vow to myself that I would not shy from any issue, no matter how controversial, no matter how combustible, that I would be policy-oriented and that I would not have any political considerations whatsoever. And you're going to read here about some very complex and flammable issues. The Haredi issue, the Bedouin issue, Israeli Arabs, the Palestinian issue, drawing on, what can I say, close to 50 years of public involvement in this country. And we're going to see what happens. It hasn't been reviewed yet. I think there are things that are going to drive people crazy on both sides, whether it be my insistence that the state of Israel recognize Reform and conservative Jews and Jewry, to the need to bring Israeli Arabs into the Israeli story on a new basis, to discarding the two-state solution in a certain ways. And it'd be very hard to pigeonhole it as either right or left. Were I to go back into government, it would be on the basis of this book. It would be based on the approach of the book, which is to say practical, clear-sighted, I would hope clear-sighted, and unafraid. And my hope is that the Israeli populace, particularly after this very painful episode, should it ever be over, will be looking for that type of approach, would be welcoming to that approach, because we're going to desperately need it if we are to not just bridge these gaps between these two Israels, but to assure ourselves, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, of a successful, prosperous, and secure second century for the state of Israel.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. You've been more than gracious. As I said at the top, so I say at the end, you've educated me. Thank you for continuing my education. I know that we're all enriched by this conversation. We're praying for peace within Israel and for some sort of reconciliation. Thank you, and thank you to your team, and thank you to Mike.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you to the Miriam Institute. Good night, everybody. Be well. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.